Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at A Boy and His Blob, Trouble on Blobolonia, a puzzle platforming title developed by Imagineering and published by Absolute Entertainment for the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America in 1989, with ports to Europe and Japan following in 1991. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 89. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges. We have discussions. We have prizes. It's all sorts of fun. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, and Wendell Jr. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a moment to give a brief overview of the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking, star count, or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really good experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I cannot recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is A Boy and His Blob. A Boy and His Blob, Trouble on Blobolonia is a puzzle platforming title developed by Imagineering and published by Absolute Entertainment for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1989 in North America, with ports to Europe and Japan following in 1991. Before we can talk about A Boy and His Blob, we need to take a step back and discuss the game's creator, David Crane, who was an incredibly influential game designer and programmer in the early years of the video game industry, having been responsible for a number of beloved classic titles, the founding of a company that still exists today, and eventual recognition as one of the top 100 game designers of all time. Back in 1975, though, Crane was simply a new college graduate with a degree in electrical engineering, and the need to find a job to begin his post-college life, which he eventually found working as a hardware designer for National Semiconductor, a company that would eventually be purchased by Texas Instruments, but who were, at the time, focused on creating integrated circuits for a wide variety of uses, from traditional computer circuitry to more specialized applications used in display devices and audio amplifiers. Crane began working in the company shortly after his graduation, but it wouldn't take long before he realized that he wanted to do something different with his life, which is what prompted him to begin looking for alternate employment opportunities. A couple years after Crane began working at National Semiconductor, a perfect opportunity would present itself, as the rapidly expanding video game company Atari was looking for game designers and programmers who could make games for their newly released Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, which is also commonly referred to as the Atari 2600. While Crane didn't have a ton of programming experience, he did have a lot of exposure to electronics and hardware engineering, which he thought he might be able to translate into a job at Atari, because he understood the underlying hardware better than many pure software developers did. It turns out Atari agreed, and Crane would in fact join the company as a game designer in 1978. After joining Atari, Crane would begin working on several different games and would also be tasked with working on the operating system for the Atari 800, an 8-bit home computer that Atari was in the process of engineering for an eventual 1979 release. While at Atari, Crane became increasingly frustrated with the compensation packages available to developers, which were, to put it mildly, non-existent. Back in the early days of Atari, game designers and developers wouldn't be paid bonuses, royalties, or any other perk for creating a best-selling game. Even if a title sold millions of copies, the creators behind those titles got nothing other than their base salary. And further, game designers and developers were not recognized or credited publicly for their contributions. In fact, companies took efforts to intentionally obscure the fact that individual people worked on their titles. The thought at Atari was, if a game was created at the company, it was a product of Atari, and the individuals who worked on that game didn't deserve any discrete recognition. The fact that they had the privilege of working at Atari was recognition enough, even if the general gaming community didn't know who worked on what titles. Interestingly, this kind of situation is exactly why early gaming Easter eggs mostly involved game developers coding hidden rooms in their games that simply displayed their name. They couldn't get recognition from the company they worked at, so they figured they were going to put their signature, so to speak, somewhere in the game itself. Despite the renegade nature of some early game developers giving themselves credit in the games they, in fact, created, that wasn't enough for many developers at Atari, and it didn't take long before Crane, along with several other employees at the company, some of whom were some of Atari's earliest game designers, decided to do something about it. In 1979, a small contingent of developers, including Crane, Alan Miller, Bob Whitehead, and Larry Kaplan, left Atari to form a new company, and in the process, created the first third-party publisher to ever exist in the video game industry. That company, which still exists today, is none other than Activision. As a founding member of Activision and the company's senior game designer, Crane had additional latitude to design the games he wanted to create, and here his overall philosophy around game design helped to direct his future efforts. Crane was always a believer in trying and doing things that others had never tried before, and in the context of video game development, that meant that he wanted to create titles and use features of video game consoles that others had never exploited before. While Crane would work on several games over Activision's early years, one concept kept occupying his time, and that was how to create a humanoid player character that could be realistically animated on Atari 2600 hardware, which, given the capabilities of the console, would be quite the feat of programming and design. We have talked briefly in the past about the Atari 2600, and how many of the games released for that console took some creative liberties with how they represented characters in games, primarily driven by the fact that the Atari 2600 did not have a ton of graphics horsepower under the hood. In fact, a lot of Atari 2600 titles were designed to use simple geometric shapes and figures as stand-ins for real characters, simply because the system was good at drawing them, and performance could be optimized as a result. Crane didn't think this was good enough, and like I mentioned, he always wanted to push the envelope of what was possible, to attempt to deliver an experience that was unexpected. So he spent a good chunk of time over the years to develop this advanced, for the time, graphics technique, eventually creating a humanoid character that actually looked and moved like a real person. There was just one problem. He had created a cool graphical trick and figured out how to make it work with Atari hardware, but he didn't have an actual game concept to go along with that trick. He toyed around with various ideas like a cops and robbers kind of game, but he never really found a game concept that he thought would make sense with the technology he was trying to implement. That would all change in 1981, which saw the release of the Steven Spielberg-George Lucas collaboration, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the very first Indiana Jones film. Upon seeing that film, Crane had a new idea for a game that he thought would be the perfect application of his new human running animation. What if he created an adventure title, set in the jungle, where you controlled a man who would need to run, jump, and avoid obstacles and enemies, all in the pursuit of hidden treasures? Crane believed that idea had real merit, and with that concept in mind, he set out to begin creating the game that would eventually be released as the much-beloved classic title, Pitfall. The story behind Pitfall's creation and the various ingenious programming techniques Crane employed that were incredibly advanced for the time, like procedurally generated environments, should likely be the focus of a separate podcast episode. But what I will say is that Pitfall really put David Crane and Activision on the map, as it would go on to widely be recognized as one of the best video games of all time, and would remain the top-selling game on the Billboard Top Video Games chart for 64 weeks straight, en route to selling over 3.5 million copies in the 3 years following its release. To say Pitfall was a big deal would be an understatement. And with Pitfall's release, David Crane firmly established himself as one of the top game designers and developers in the industry. Crane would continue contributing to various Activision titles, including subsequent entries in the Pitfall series, through the mid-'80s, enjoying his time spent as a founding member of the rapidly growing company. That would all start to change in 1986, which is when a corporate restructuring occurred that placed a man named Bruce Davis as the new Chief Executive Officer, or CEO, of Activision. Crane and Davis did not see eye to eye on many things, with Crane believing Davis was difficult to work with. Crane also recalled a prior incident involving the closure of one of Activision's early third-party development partners, iMagic, which he believed was handled poorly by Davis in a prior role. And furthermore, under Davis's leadership, a new compensation package was being created, whereby employees would receive less salary pay but would instead receive other incentives and bonuses for creating games that reached certain sales milestones. The thing is, that new compensation package was only described in vague terms, and it wasn't really clear what the impact to employees was going to be. Was it possible they'd make more total money under the new arrangement, assuming their game sold well? Well, sure, it was a possibility, but without concrete details, there was no guarantee that would happen. All of these issues combined to make Crane no longer want to work for Activision, at least not as a direct member of their staff, so he ended up leaving the company to go work with Hasbro in their interactive entertainment division. Now, some longer-time listeners might be seeing a connection here, but others may be wondering, what the heck was Hasbro doing in the mid-'80s that could have had any correlation to the video game market? Hasbro was primarily a toy manufacturer. What was their play with video games? And to that I would say, yes, Hasbro was known for their toys, but they were also exploring the creation of a video game console that was designed to use VHS videocassettes as a means of playing full-motion video titles, using a bunch of technical wizardry that allowed multiple video streams to be encoded into a single linear VHS tape. While the linearity of those video streams was unchanging, players would be able to switch between multiple streams in real time. Like, say, if you were trying to monitor video footage from a multi-camera surveillance system in the hopes of protecting a house full of college girls from vampiric creatures. That technology formed the basis for the console that would be codenamed Project Nemo, which would eventually be renamed to the Control Vision console prior to its eventual cancellation, and the game I subtly described was, of course, the full-motion video classic, Night Trap. David Crane, when he joined Hasbro, actually joined the team working on Project Nemo, under eventual Digital Pictures founder Tom Zito, and while at Hasbro, he contributed to some of the technical development for the console, as well as performed some editing to the core footage that had been filmed for Night Trap's eventual release. I always love it when another piece of history comes up that makes our understanding of prior discussion topics even more complete, and this is one I found particularly interesting. For anyone who may be curious, you can check out several of our prior episodes, including our Night Trap episode from several months ago, if you want to learn more about the failed control vision experiment. Anyway, while Crane found that working with Hasbro was interesting, he ultimately only stayed there for around a year before yet another opportunity would present itself. This time, the prospect of joining a relatively new company called Absolute Entertainment in 1988, which had been founded by another ex-Activision developer named Gary Kitchen in 1986. When Crane joined the Absolute team, he was quickly assigned to the development arm of the company, which was known as Imagineering, and once on staff, he began working on a couple of new Atari titles, Skateboardin' for the Atari 2600 and Super Skateboardin' for the Atari 7800, both of which represented some of the earliest skateboarding titles ever created in video game format. Crane, having recalled the work he performed on Pitfall, was able to use the Atari hardware to great effect, and in the process, created the title using advanced graphics techniques, including the ability to both ride on and carry your skateboard depending on the situation, coupled with graphics that, similar to Pitfall, represented an actual human being on the screen as opposed to the simpler geometry that many Atari 2600 titles would utilize. Crane's work on both skateboarding titles was commendable, but despite his continued mastery of Atari hardware, it had been years since Atari was the true industry leader in the video game market. As we've talked about on prior episodes of the podcast, the new king of the market was the Japanese company Nintendo, who after the release of the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System, depending on where you lived, had taken the video game industry by storm. So much so that the phrase playing Nintendo became synonymous with the act of playing video games in general. It didn't matter whether those video games were in fact Nintendo titles or if they were made for a different company's console entirely. For parents and families of the time, Nintendo was literally the name of the game. As you might imagine, for a company that had traditionally focused on Atari software, this market shift could have potentially disastrous financial impact, and here Absolute Entertainment had to make a decision. Do they continue to focus on the Atari ecosystem, despite the console being completely outclassed in the market? Or do they pivot their attention to the shiny new leader, and in the process attempt to figure out development for a brand new technology platform that they had little prior experience with? As you may have guessed, Absolute did in fact decide to pivot their attention to Nintendo's 8-bit console family, and in the process, they faced yet another decision. What game could they make that would make a splash and hopefully set the company up for future success? They knew they wanted to create something original, and here the Absolute leadership team recalled that David Crane had always been known as someone who had unique, unexpected ideas that over the course of his career made him renowned as one of the better game designers in the industry. It stands to reason that if the company really wanted to create something new for their first Nintendo title, they probably should leverage Crane's already proven game design talents. And this is exactly what ended up happening, as Crane was tapped on the shoulder to create Absolute Entertainment's first NES title, an effort that would eventually result in the birth of A Boy and His Blob, Trouble on Blobolonia. As Crane began working on the game, he was influenced by both Hanna-Barbera cartoon characters as well as the work that he himself had already completed when he made Pitfall and Pitfall 2. According to Crane, the state of the console adventure game genre had progressed gradually since his early efforts on those Pitfall titles, and he knew he wanted his new game to be a console adventure title, complete with a number of different ways of interacting with the game world. What he didn't like, though, was the way inventory-based games were being designed around this time. He remarked that games with inventory management, at least on consoles, all provided inelegant solutions, and despite wanting to create a game with a variety of potential tools, he knew he wanted to improve upon the current design paradigm that was prevalent on console adventures. With that overriding design goal in mind, he sat down to begin coming up with ideas for the game itself. With one idea, the concept of a transforming blob-like creature who, depending on what he ate, could change into a variety of shapes and tools, being something he thought had a lot of promise. Not only could those blob transformations provide an intriguing gameplay loop, but it also solved the issue of having tons of discrete inventory items to manage. In effect, the blob would become all of the tools the player would need to complete the game. All the player needed to manage was what food to feed to that blob. And here, Crane came up with another idea. What if, rather than manage a bunch of different foods, the player would instead have the ability to use jelly beans of different flavors to manipulate the blob's state? This was another idea that Crane thought would be a fun, creative way to design the game, and it didn't take long before these general concepts became doctrine. And with that, development work on A Boy and His Blob officially began. The process of deciding which transformations the Blob, whose official name was Blobbert, could take on was driven primarily by an early wish list of potential transformations that Crane had written up and bounced against the technical capabilities of the NES hardware, followed by validating whether that transformation would, in fact, be meaningful to the player. This process evolved over the course of the game's initial design, until finally 14 discrete transformations were identified, and with them, 14 individual jellybean flavors were assigned. In an attempt to make the game easier for players to understand, each jellybean was assigned a flavor that loosely corresponded to the action or tool that Blobbert would take on. As an example, one of the jellybean flavors was Punch, which when fed to Blobbert caused him to make a hole in the ground, similar to how a hole punch would make holes in a piece of paper. While I'd argue that the flavor-action pairs are not necessarily the most obvious associations in practice, I can confirm that they did help with memorizing which flavors did what, at least once you play the game for a while. Actually bringing the game to life beyond that initial design would fall to David Crane himself, and here the unique stipulations of Nintendo's license for the title drove some pretty crazy work conditions. Nintendo, upon hearing the pitch for the game, decided that they wanted A Boy and His Blob to be an exclusive for their 8-bit console family, so they entered into a licensing deal that would make that exclusivity legally binding. There was just one issue. Nintendo wanted to deliver the game by the 1989 holiday season, and the agreement to make the game for Nintendo's consoles had just been finalized in the summer of 1989. And in order to complete the game in time for cartridges to be produced, shipped, and arrive on store shelves, the game would need to be completed in around the September timeframe, which meant that David Crane would only have 6 weeks to take A Boy and His Blob from concept to completion. Longtime listeners may be getting a strange sense of deja vu here, because this same exact kind of situation had occurred during the development of E.T. for the Atari 2600, when Howard Scott Warshaw was required to work for 6 weeks straight to create a game that most developers had refused to work on, because they believed it would be impossible to create a full game with such a compressed timeline. Warshaw proved everyone wrong, in that he did, in fact, complete development for E.T. in just 6 weeks. Though the end result of that effort was a title that has lived in infamy since its release, with many gamers critiquing the title as one of the worst games of all time. I shared my own opinions of the game during our E.T. episode, so if you want to learn more about that one, definitely check out that episode. I mention this because it certainly felt like history was repeating itself. The only question was, would David Crane succeed in delivering a worthwhile title, or would his efforts end the same way as Warshaw's E.T. fumbles? For his part, Crane was determined to create a good game, despite the tight timelines, and for the 6 weeks of development time that he had, he devoted every ounce of his being to creating the game, even going so far as to rent a room from a cheap flop house near his office so that he would avoid distractions, and working on the title for 16 to 20 hours a day, almost every day, for 6 weeks straight. That, as you might imagine, is not a healthy work-life balance, and I would never condone or recommend anyone attempt to do something similar. Crane, however, really believed in the title, and even beyond the crazy hours he was already putting in, his final development push involved a 48-hour straight coding session with no sleep at all, just to make sure he could get A Boy and His Blob ready to go for the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, in late 1989. Miraculously, he did in fact complete the game in time for the show, and after that 48-hour development binge, he boarded a plane for Chicago to demo the title to showgoers, while each evening was spent squashing any bugs that may have been found on the show floor. To say Crane was dedicated to making the best game he could would be an understatement, and for what it's worth, his efforts did in fact lead to some early praise for the title, as A Boy and His Blob would be recognized with the CES Best of Show award after its 1989 showing, which I've got to believe made Crane feel that all of those long days and nights were at least somewhat worth it. After that successful CES showing, A Boy and His Blob would end up releasing just prior to Christmas in 1989, meaning David Crane accomplished what he had set out to do. he brought a brand new game from concept to final product in just 6 weeks, and early indications were that he had avoided the same fate as Howard Scott Warshaw's E.T. title. Once critics started playing the game, though, feedback was decidedly mixed. While some individuals praised the game's unique gameplay, puzzles, and graphics, other reviewers were less kind, with several claiming the game was simply average, while others praised the game's concept but ultimately felt that the game itself was just not fun. Despite that critical mixed bag, the game would have much greater success from a consumer perspective, as it became a popular title with children and parents alike, so much so that A Boy and His Blob was recognized with a Parents' Choice Award in 1990. Owing largely to the game's ability to engage players while presenting an entirely non-violent, mostly puzzle-oriented gameplay experience. This recognition for David Crane was almost more important than the accolades he received during the 1989 CES, as he believed his game was actually having a positive influence on children, something that he was incredibly proud of. In the years following A Boy and His Blob's release, there'd continue to be a moderate degree of focus given to the title, with a sequel for the Nintendo Game Boy portable system coming out in 1990, and an attempted movie and toy tie-in, which unfortunately never came to be. Despite A Boy and His Blob being a successful title for Absolute Entertainment and its development studio Imagineering, as well as representing the company's first game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, it never really resulted in a strong franchise similar to other Nintendo properties, and Absolute Entertainment would end up going bankrupt in 1995. After the closure of the company, David Crane and several other staff members would end up forming a new company, Skyworks Technologies, which from what I can tell remained active in the video game industry for 15 years before it seemingly became inactive. I don't know whether the company still exists today, but based on the fact that their website is simply a coming soon page, I've got to believe that the company is, for all intents and purposes, no longer in business. While Skyworks Technologies worked on a fair number of games over its lifespan, none of them ended up having much of a legacy. David Crane, however, as an early video game pioneer who was able to make games that defied expectations, continues to be widely praised as one of the best and most influential video game designers of all time. And back in 2010, the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences awarded Crane with its very first Pioneer Award, a recognition of just how important he was to the development of the video game industry. To put the significance of that award into perspective, Alan Alcorn, the designer behind Pong, wouldn't become recognized as a pioneer until 2015. Crane's body of work was considered more influential and more impactful than the creation of Pong, and that is definitely saying something. Interestingly, though, David Crane's story doesn't end there, as he and longtime collaborator Gary Kitchen ended up forming yet another company in 2020 called Audacity Games, whose singular focus is the development of new titles for, surprisingly, the Atari 2600. That's right, Crane's new company, in 2020, enabled him to return to the roots of his video game career. He was yet again hard at work on creating new and unexpected experiences for the Atari 2600 console, a full 42 years after he created his first game. That, from my perspective, is one heck of a career. While A Boy and His Blob wouldn't spawn a mega successful franchise, it would eventually be remade in 2009 for the Nintendo Wii console, followed by a high-definition remaster of that remake in 2016 for then-modern consoles like the Xbox One and Sony PlayStation 4, amongst others. The original title would end up being re-released on the Wii Virtual Console service in 2010, and interestingly, just last year in 2023, a standalone compilation of A Boy and His Blob and its Game Boy sequel, The Rescue of Princess Blobette, would be released for all current consoles, a turn of events that I will readily admit surprised me. While A Boy and His Blob might not have the same kind of legacy as its legendary creator does, that in no way diminishes the quality and ambitions of the title. In just 6 weeks, a fully realized game was brought to life, and unlike other titles made under highly compressed timelines, it did in fact garner a fair degree of praise amongst certain critics and consumer groups. I was always curious about the title, though I admittedly had never played it until I sat down to work on this podcast episode. Well, I'll share my own opinions of the game in just a couple minutes. The fact is that A Boy and His Blob represents a significant achievement on the part of its creator, and regardless of whether you yourself have experienced the title, or if you've never even heard of it, I do believe it warrants additional discussion amongst the gaming community. Time will tell whether the game ever receives more widespread recognition than it currently has. But independent of that unknown future, the game as it exists is, at a minimum, a unique title in gaming history, and as such, is certainly something that I believe deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play A Boy and His Blob, Trouble on Blobolonia today versus when it was released 35 years ago. When you first start up A Boy and His Blob, you're presented with a scene where you're standing on the street and next to you is your blob sidekick character, an amorphous jelly named Blobbert, and your first thought, if you're like me, is likely something to the effect of, okay, standard NES platformer. We'll probably run around a bunch of different screens, stomp on enemies, jump from one ledge to the next, climb ladders, and generally navigate a series of levels to progress through the game. And if you're like me, you'll probably pick up the controller and start playing without really knowing what it is you're supposed to be doing. Because heck, this is a platforming title. You don't need to read the manual for a platformer, right? Then, approximately 2 minutes or so into the game, if you're like me, you'll probably hit a brick wall and think to yourself, well, how do I jump? And then you might think to yourself, how do I get to that lower level? And then you'll probably think to yourself, wait a second, how do I actually play this game? Well, the good news is that I went through all of these emotions and more when I played through the title, and I'm going to tell you what A Boy and His Blob is actually about. Because what I've discovered is that there were many children who received the game as a gift back when it was released, only to discover they had no clue what was actually going on in the game. And honestly, I was right there with them when I first started my playthrough. What I learned, and what I had to remind myself as I was getting my bearings, is that A Boy and His Blob is not your traditional platforming title, and in fact, it is most like a puzzle game with some very light platforming elements, in many ways very similar to games like Lemmings, albeit with a lot more direct control of your character. The general structure of the game involves you playing as a boy who has a constant companion, the titular Blob, and your goal is to make your way to Blobolonia, which is a separate world where an evil dictator has basically installed himself as the supreme ruler of the land. Your Blob friend, Blobbert, is a former citizen of that world, and it is up to you to help him return to his home planet to save the day, and along the way, Blobbert will help you figure out how to make that happen. In effect, the game is broken up into two parts. The first section involves you attempting to gather a number of treasures scattered about an underground subway and cave system, with the intent of using those treasures to purchase a number of items that will, ostensibly, help you on the rest of your journey. The second part of the game takes place on Blobolonia itself, where you'll have to put your skills to the test as you make your way through a number of obstacles and enemies en route to a final confrontation with the dictator who took over the world. Getting those treasures in the first part, of which there are 22 different items, is going to be tricky because you have very limited platforming abilities when controlling the boy. You can walk or run from side to side, but basically, that's it. And early on, you might walk down a set of steps and see a treasure in a corner of the screen with no apparent way to get to it. So what the heck are you supposed to do? Well, this is where Blobbert comes in, as rather than simply controlling the boy and platforming through a bunch of different screens, Blobbert is unique in that he can perform a number of different actions and take on a number of different shapes and objects when fed different flavored jelly beans. And luckily, you've got a pocket full of them just waiting to be used. This mechanic, using your jelly beans to transform Blobbert into any number of useful gadgets, is what makes up the majority of the gameplay experience, and is the basis for every single puzzle that you find throughout the game world. Every single obstacle, outside of indestructible enemies which need to be avoided rather than attacked, can be overcome using some combination of jelly bean flavor with blob-based transformation, and it is in this way that the game most resembles titles like Lemmings, like I mentioned earlier, at least in terms of the skills usage that pervades both titles. To make the comparison more explicit, and because it is helpful in explaining the concept behind A Boy and His Blob, in Lemmings, you act as a sort of all-powerful god in that you can assign each lemming in a level to one of several different skills, and once you make that assignment, that lemming will carry out his task without fail, and without stopping, until some other force acts on it. The way to progress through each level is by combining different skills assigned to different lemmings to create a mostly safe passage from the entrance of each level to the exit, saving as many lemmings along the way as possible. While you won't be tasked with saving creatures in A Boy and His Blob, the concept of assigning skills to allow further progression into the game is the core gameplay mechanic that forms the foundation of the entire game. And here you have a huge variety of options available as far as what skills to assign to Blobbert to address the game's various puzzles. In fact, it probably makes sense to go over exactly what skills you have available to you, and how they impact the act of playing the game. Each skill, like I mentioned, is assigned to a different jellybean flavor, and as you toss those jellybeans to Blobbert for him to eat, you'll notice that he'll transform into something that will hopefully be useful in tackling whatever challenge is currently in front of you. While you have a ton of jellybeans available to you, your inventory is not infinite, as you do have a specific number of each jellybean available at the start of the game. You can find additional jellybeans as you play to partially replenish your stock, and there are at least a couple of special jellybeans that need to be discovered while exploring in the first part of the game in order to actually beat the title. But for the most part, every puzzle is solvable using the stock of jellybeans that you begin your adventure with. So let's talk about each jellybean and what they allow you and Blobbert to do. And let's start with the licorice jellybean. The licorice jellybean turns Blobbert into a ladder, which can be useful in reaching ledges that are otherwise unreachable. The ladder only extends a certain distance, and can only extend upwards, meaning if you're on a ledge and you want to get to a part of the screen below you, a ladder is not going to do it. There is a bit of a trick as far as ladder positioning goes, as if you place the ladder just right, when Blobbert returns to his normal form, then he'll simply retract the ladder and land on the platform you just climbed up onto. If you don't place it right, then Blobbert will fall down below, and you'll need to use a different jellybean to get him to rejoin you. More on that in a minute or two. You also have a strawberry jellybean, which allows Blobbert to transform into a horizontal bridge in order to cross otherwise uncrossable gaps in the floor. You have to be careful when giving Blobbert these jellybeans though, as if he's not close enough to the gap you want to cross, he'll simply eat the jellybean and not transform, which is effectively a waste of a perfectly good jellybean. Coconut jellybeans will turn Blobbert into a coconut, which you can then pick up and throw, causing him to roll across whatever screens are nearby. I'll admit that I didn't really see much of a need for the coconut jellybean during my playthrough, though I can see why certain people might find it useful. A gameplay mechanic we haven't talked about yet is the fact that each part of the game, the underground caverns and Blobolonia, are a collection of screens that make up a fully interconnected world. As you're navigating this world, there might be areas where you're standing at a hole and you don't know if the fall will kill you, or if it's simply a short drop to the next screen. And yes, you will die if you fall too far. Any height bigger than 1.5 screens worth of height will kill you. Anyway, there are multiple points in the game where you feel like you're facing a dead end, and the only possible option is to go down. But down into what? Luckily, if you toss a jellybean down a chasm or hole, the camera will follow the jellybean's flight, showing you any screens it passes through along the way, and giving you a sneak peek into whether you'll survive the fall or drop and go splat. This works really well for vertical exploration, but you might also want to see what's in front of you horizontally. Well, this is where the coconut jellybean comes into play, as you can toss Blobbert horizontally, having him roll along and giving you a safe preview of the screens to come. Like I said, I didn't really use this much, if at all, during my playthrough, but it's nice that the mechanic exists for players who might be a bit more cautious. Moving on, you also have a cola jellybean, which, given its carbonated properties, will turn Blobbert into a bubble that you can get inside and float around the game. While this bubble mode has limited use in most of the game, there is a section of the underground with water that you need to navigate through, and the bubble from the cola jellybean is the only way you can actually survive the water, since otherwise you'll die as soon as you touch it. The cinnamon jellybean is one of the most limited use jellybeans in the game, at least from a puzzle perspective, as I believe it's only used in a single screen. Cinnamon jellybeans turn Blobbert into a blowtorch, which will make short work of certain objects like spiderwebs. Otherwise, the best use for the cinnamon jellybean is actually to assist with object placement, as you can carry blowtorch Blobbert to any spot on the screen and drop him in place. Then, when you whistle to him to drop him from his current transformed form, he will stay in that place, allowing you to feed him a different jellybean with more precise placement than would otherwise be available. And actually, at this point, I should probably mention a bit about movement in the game and traversal. By default, as you move around the game world, Blobbert will hop along after you, though he will only touch certain sections of the ground, because his hops will, by definition, bypass certain areas, since a hop isn't a continuous movement, like, say, a normal walk would be. Most of the time, this isn't an issue, but there are some areas of the game that require precise positioning of various transformed blob forms, like the latter we previously discussed. In those instances, transforming Blobbert into a blowtorch with a cinnamon jellybean, picking him up, and dropping him in the exact right spot where you want to place your ladder, or whatever other item you need to use, is useful, and can save some headache involved with positioning Blobbert just right to solve a particularly tricky puzzle. Outside of that positioning nuance, though, the cinnamon jellybean is used in exactly one screen in the entire game, and considering how many of the jellybeans the game gives you, I've got to believe that the designers recognized its true use was in navigational placement, not puzzle solutions. Anyway, we also have an apple jellybean, which turns Blobbert into a car jack that can lift up objects. This is another one that has limited use, as I believe there are only 2 spots in the game where this one is needed. They are some pretty important spots though, and while I won't spoil any of the puzzles here, I would urge you to save your apple jellybeans for a couple of screens where they very obviously have a use. Because if you run out of them, you will literally be unable to complete the game. The vanilla jellybean, by contrast, is incredibly useful throughout your entire playthrough, as that one turns Blobbert into an umbrella that can serve a couple of different purposes. For one, umbrellas can very nicely protect your head from falling debris, like rocks, which will help avoid a nasty death, since in this game, one hit kills you. But the other, arguably more useful benefit of using an umbrella is that it allows you to float slowly down holes and chasms without falling to your death, and this is absolutely essential in several different areas of the game. Unfortunately, you don't really have any control during your fall, as the game will maintain whatever momentum you had when you began your drop. But regardless, falling slowly, as opposed to plummeting rapidly, is a useful skill to have. The tangerine jellybean is another really important jellybean for navigation, as it turns Blobbert into a trampoline that you can use to jump progressively higher on. This one is one of the more interesting mechanics in the game, as the trampoline can let you jump really high, assuming you keep holding up on your control pad as you continue to bounce on the object. Based on my testing, in the first part of the game where you're navigating the underground caverns, there is effectively no limit to how high you can jump. You can simply keep holding up, and each successive jump will continue to propel you higher into the air until you hit something, like a cave ceiling. In the later section of the game on Blobolonia, there does appear to be a limit to how far you can vertically jump, but I'm assuming that's because a good chunk of that area is based outdoors, and letting you jump progressively higher and higher would either break the game or send you shooting off into space, neither of which would be all that great. Assuming you use the trampoline under normal conditions, you can at any point choose to break away from your vertical jump by pressing left or right, which will then send you off on a pseudo-parabolic fall in whatever direction you pressed. This is not quite as straightforward as it may sound, because if you miscalculate the distance to a nearby ledge, you will often plummet to your death, since trampoline use often involves jumping greater than the defined fall death distance of 1.5 screens worth of height. Judging the curved drop after breaking off from a vertical jump also takes some getting used to, and I will readily admit that I died multiple times while trying to understand the best way to jump and fall from the trampoline. You also have a root beer jellybean, which serves one singular purpose. After you collect some treasures and buy items at the nearby shop, you can give the root beer jellybean to Blobbert to turn him into a rocket ship, which will transport you to the second part of the game, Blobolonia. Now at this point, I'd like to discuss another aspect of the game that we touched upon only briefly before, and that is the treasure collection that makes up the first 2/3 or so of the game. When you start playing the game, 22 different treasures are available to be found in the underground caverns that you'll soon be navigating. The interesting thing is that you don't have to find all 22 different treasures in order to beat the game, because all those treasures do is provide you with one of several different weapon loadouts for the second section of the game on Blobolonia. The more treasures you collect, the more vitamins you'll receive from the health food shop on the street level of the game, and each of those vitamins, which are vitamins A, B, and C naturally, have different projectile trajectories once you land on Blobolonia. If you get all 22 treasures before you go to the shop, then you'll have a vitamin loadout that is, honestly, incredibly excessive for what you actually may need. If you get too few treasures, though, you may only get a handful of each vitamin, which might make surviving Blobolonia difficult. From a personal perspective, as I was learning the game, I ended up making a map and ensuring that I discovered and collected every single treasure before attempting to proceed. But ultimately, I determined that this level of completion is not actually needed in order to beat the game. During the playthrough where I did in fact collect all 22 treasures, I ended up dying fairly quickly once on Blobolonia, which was a major disappointment as you only have 5 lives available to you, and if you lose all of them, it's game over and you have to restart from the beginning of your adventure. There are no save points and there are no continues. While you do restart fairly close to where you died if you have lives available, if you run out of lives, the game is pretty darn unforgiving. What ended up happening with my playthrough was, I collected the 22 treasures, got a ton of vitamins, and then landed on Blobolonia, only to be defeated well before the final boss. So, my next playthrough, content that I had already seen everything the first part of the game had to offer, I only collected a minimal set of treasures, which left me with minimal vitamins by the time I reached Blobolonia, but also reduced the amount of replay time required to get back to where I had died. I appreciated the fact that the game didn't really gate you off from progressing to Blobolonia, other than requiring a couple of special jellybeans, which we have yet to talk about and can only be found in a certain section of the underground part of the game. Exploring and finding every treasure was fun the first time, though it would have quickly become tedious if I had to collect every treasure every time I lost all my lives on Blobolonia. Luckily, the game provides a shortcut, trading skill for time, which I think was a great approach to reducing the potential tedium of multiple replays. Moving on, the next jellybean you have access to is the honey jellybean, which will turn Blobbert into a hummingbird that will fly to you from wherever he may be currently positioned. This is primarily used as a way to get Blobbert to rejoin you in situations where you might otherwise be unreachable, and to illustrate this jellybean's use, let's talk about a specific example. Suppose you just use the tangerine jellybean and resulting trampoline to bounce upwards several screens before eventually landing on a ledge. Well, Blobbert would have no way of reaching you, even after whistling to return him to his blob state. He has no special abilities outside of those granted to him by the various jellybeans in the game, and because you have no abilities other than Blobbert's transformational capabilities, progressing in the game requires you and Blobbert to remain close to each other. In situations where you've progressed to an area where Blobbert can't reach you, the Honey Jellybean's hummingbird form can allow Blobbert to fly to you, thereby bringing the two of you back together to continue your joint adventure. Another jellybean actually performs a similar function, that being the catch-up jellybean, but that one works a little bit differently. It turns out that Blobbert hates ketchup, so if you try to feed him a ketchup jellybean, he simply won't take it. So you might be wondering what purpose that particular jellybean might serve. Well, it turns out that ketchup jellybeans allow Blobbert to catch up, get it, to wherever you throw the jellybean. As long as Blobbert is in his blob form and not otherwise transformed, you can toss a ketchup jellybean onto the ground and he'll magically teleport to the location instantaneously. This is useful mostly to speed up certain sections of the game, as the instant teleport is much faster than waiting for Blobbert to fly to you as a hummingbird. That said, you have a fairly limited supply of ketchup jellybeans, so you do need to be a bit frugal in how often you use them. At the same time though, you will never need a ketchup jellybean to solve any puzzles, and other jellybeans serve a similar purpose, so the ketchup jellybean is really only there to make navigation a bit quicker. More useful in more situations is the punch jellybean, which is used to create a hole in the ground wherever Blobbert is currently standing. This is the main mechanism you'll use to delve deeper and deeper into the underground section of the game, and there are certain areas where progressing further requires the blind use of the punch jellybean, which might result in an immediate and untimely death. Because you can't throw a jellybean through a punch-made hole in the same way you can toss a jellybean down an environmental chasm, there can be some trial and error associated with finding the right screens and the right spots to use the punch jellybean, which can be a bit frustrating if you guess wrong and end up falling to your death. That being said, I found it interesting that the game, despite being a screen-to-screen kind of design, actually understands the full world at any given point in time, despite only showing you a single screen's worth of visuals at a time. That might sound confusing, so let me explain. My assumption when I started playing the game was that each screen was effectively a separate gameplay space, and that the game would only ever really care about a single screen at any given time, since that's really the only area you have the ability to interact with. But in fact, the game understands every screen and where each screen is in relation to every other screen, a fact that I discovered when playing with the punch jellybean. I was in a room where the only way forward was down, so I figured I'd create a hole in the floor and attempt to drop down. So I created the hole and jumped in, assuming I'd fall through to the next screen, only to find out that I could only pass through the hole to my waist before I simply stood there, unable to drop further. The reason for that partial drop had to do with the fact that I placed the hole over a section of the ground that was on top of a ledge in the next screen, so when I dropped through, I couldn't pass through all the way onto the next screen. So I repositioned my hole to a different section of the ground, which let me fall through it without issue. I remember thinking that this was a small touch, but pretty darn awesome to see in an NES-era title. It gave me the impression that the game was in fact an open world kind of experience, despite only showing you, the player, a single screen at a time, and I found that to be an unexpected and delightful surprise. Anyway, those were the main jelly beans that you begin the game with. You also find two special jelly beans whose use is limited to specific areas of Blobolonia, and while those jelly beans are not nearly as useful as the others we've discussed, they are absolutely essential to beating the game. One of those jelly beans is an orange jelly bean, which turns Blobbert into a vitamin-shooting machine gun and turns you into Rambo, assuming you pick the gun up and shoot it at the various enemies that make up Blobolonia's world. This vitamin gun uses the vitamins that you previously brought from the store in the first section of the game, and like we talked about, the number of treasures that you find correlates directly to your vitamin ammo loadout that you have available while exploring Blobolonia. While being able to shoot bad guys is cool, and the control scheme, which allows you to aim in any direction, is better implemented than it has any right being for a puzzle platform title, the actual meaningful use of the vitamin gun is limited to only a couple of screens on Blobolonia. And actually at this point, we should talk a bit about enemies in the game and how they work. In short, the majority of the game is pure puzzle-driven gameplay, where you have to figure out how to navigate your environment as opposed to figuring out how to defeat various enemies. There are some sections of the underground, though, that have a couple of bouncing rock enemies which, if they touch you one time, will kill you. The only way to get past those enemies is to avoid them and time your movement to counteract theirs, as nothing you do can actually defeat them. On Blobolonia, though, things are different, as you're presented with a bunch of new enemies once you land on the planet, like bouncing marshmallows, falling cherry bombs, and floating popcorn pieces, which, similar to the rock monsters in the underground section, will kill you if you come into contact with them. These enemies, though, are able to be attacked using a combination of the orange jelly beans vitamin blaster and whatever vitamin loadout you were able to purchase from the health food store, and shooting them can potentially be helpful in progressing through Blobolonia. That said, the only screens that the vitamin blaster is absolutely essential on is the set of screens with falling cherries, which in the game represents cherry bombs. You have to shoot all of the cherries before they hit the ground, otherwise an explosion will occur and you'll end up dying, regardless of where you are in the game world. It's not particularly challenging to shoot all of the cherries, especially if you collected a fair number of treasures earlier in the game and therefore have a sizable vitamin ammo count in your inventory, but it can be a bit tricky if you decided to skip some of the treasures from the first section of the game, which might leave you with fewer vitamins than what you might need to survive. From my perspective, you really don't need many vitamins to make it past the cherry screens, but your mileage may vary depending on your own skill and aiming ability. Other than the orange jelly bean, the other special jelly bean you'll find is the lime jelly bean, which serves one singular purpose. It will turn Blobbert into a key, which is required to unlock the big bad guy's lair at the end of the game. You only get a couple of lime jelly beans in any given playthrough, so this is one where you really do need to conserve and not mess around with it. Without a lime jelly bean, you cannot beat the game, so I would only use this one where there is a very obvious door that needs to be unlocked. So, those are all of the skills you have at your disposal as you play the game, and I've got to say, there is a ton of variety here. I was really surprised at how varied the gameplay became as I made my way throughout the game, and once I got used to what each jelly bean did, the act of playing became engaging and fun. I'll let you know more about how I feel about the more specific aspects of the game in just a couple minutes, but first, as we usually do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around this time frame where we did not have the internet, we did not have YouTube to look up gameplay videos. All we had potentially were reviews in magazines and what the box looked like in the store. If the front of the box looked cool, we'd pick it up, turn it over. If the back of the box made the game sound cool, we might actually purchase it. So for A Boy and His Blob, Trouble in Blobolonia, the back of the box says, "Help save Blobolonia. Blob has come from the distant planet Blobolonia in search of an Earth boy to help him save his world. Join him on his fantastic adventure in mysterious caverns beneath the Earth searching for treasures. Then travel to Blobolonia to battle the evil Emperor. Discover Blob's amazing appetite for jelly beans and the different transformations that occur with each flavor. Learn to use these shapes to overcome even the most outrageous obstacles. A Boy and His Blob is a fantastic journey filled with constant surprises and humorous characters." And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, and I gotta say, this one does sound kinda interesting to me, but I will also say that the front of the box is actually way more interesting than the back of the box, because the front of the box is presented in almost a comic strip-ish kind of view, and now that looks awesome. So the front of the box would have definitely made me pick this game up had I seen it on the store shelves. The back of the box, okay. I mean, it doesn't make the game sound bad, but I don't know that it is 100% truly engaging. But the front of the box, that definitely has my attention. It's now time to talk about some of the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics for A Boy and His Blob are fairly traditional 8-bit NES-styled visuals, with pixel art-driven sprites and tile-based environments making up the majority of the game. And honestly, for what it is, it's totally fine. You know how when you play some games you think, I don't know how this particular system could have possibly been powerful enough to generate these types of visuals? Well, you're not going to say that here, as A Boy and His Blob pretty much looks exactly like what you would expect an NES title to look like. I'm not complaining, and I think the game looks good for the era that the game was made in, but the game doesn't really transcend that era from a visual perspective. The one thing I do want to note, though, is that I thought the environmental diversity between the first part of the game, which largely takes place in underground caverns, and Blobolonia, which partially takes place in a bright grassy overworld, was very well done. I admit that the constant caverns made me feel a bit ho-hum as I was playing the game, though that ho-humness immediately went away as soon as I discovered the much greener, brighter world of Blobolonia, and I've gotta believe that the major contrast from the underground to Blobolonia was entirely intentional and was done as a way to, at least partially, reward players for making their way through some pretty drab cavern screens. I have no proof of that, it's just how it felt to me. Taking a look at the game's animations, they were there. I mean, nothing looked bad per se, and I appreciated the blob transformation animations that were included in the game, but everything here felt fairly limited, and even the transformations were really only a few keyframes at the end of the day, which made them feel a bit less detailed than I would have hoped. Once again, I have no true complaint here, as the animations were certainly a function of the time and system that they were designed for. It's just that I would have loved to see something that was a bit more advanced than simply being the norm. Moving on to the sound and music, as I sit here a few weeks after playing the game for several hours and eventually beating it, I can honestly say that I have no recollection of the music or any sounds at all. I mean, I know it existed because I remember thinking to myself, this music sounds okay, but other than that, none of that music has made its way into any area of my brain for longer-term storage. All this means, though, is that for me, the music and sound effects are entirely forgettable. though I do believe that they made sense and worked well within the context of the various scenes you play through in the game itself. They're just not all that memorable. It's not something you're going to be humming day after beating the game. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as an unnamed boy who one day comes upon an amorphous blob named Blobbert. You discover that Blobbert is from the planet Blobolonia, a world that has been taken over by an evil dictator, imprisoning its inhabitants and causing all sorts of havoc and destruction. Being the helpful boy you are, you decide to join forces with Blobbert to hopefully save his homeworld, and along the way you discover that through the magic of flavored jellybeans, Blobbert can transform into a number of different objects to aid you in your adventure. Can the two of you return to Blobolonia and depose the evil emperor that threatens Blobbert's home? There's only one way to find out. So the story here is pretty traditional platforming fare, and honestly, it works. The focus of the game is squarely on the gameplay, not the story, and as such, there doesn't need to be a ton of backstory and lore to deliver a meaningful, engaging experience. I'm glad the backstory exists, but I don't really have much more to say about it, other than it does, in fact, exist, and it is fine within the context of the game. Moving on to the playability and controls, we have talked a lot about the general structure of the game and the way you interact with the game world, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to talk a bit more about, though, are how the game controls and a couple of critiques that I have that impact the overall playability of the title. First, the controls here are deceptively deep, as many of the objects Blobbert can transform into will introduce a new context-sensitive control scheme into the game, which is both easy to understand and also adds a good deal of variety to the experience. When you first start playing and you realize all you can do is throw jellybeans at Blobbert, whistle for him to come closer, and walk, you might think that the gameplay wouldn't be all that deep. But with all of the transformations available to you, and the shifts in the controls that those transformations drive, there is a surprising amount of depth here, and I appreciated the amount of varied gameplay that the game delivers, despite being an NES title that effectively only has 2 face buttons coupled with select, start, and a D-pad on your controller. Speaking of select, that's the way you cycle through your available jellybean inventory. And if I wanted to be nitpicky, I could cite the fact that scrolling through these jellybeans can sometimes be a bit cumbersome, especially if you mistakenly miss the jellybean you wanted to use and therefore have to cycle through the whole list all over again. Like we talked about, there's a pretty good number of different jellybeans available, so the process of cycling through all of them can get a bit tedious over time. I wonder if a Mega Man-like system of pulling up a list of the jellybeans and allowing you to select which one to equip might have worked better. It's not that the current implementation is awful, I just feel like it could have been more streamlined. That being said, and generally speaking, the controls work well within the game, but I do have to call attention to one aspect of the game's playability that does take a while to get used to, and that is the game's momentum-based movement. In short, if you hold down a direction on your D-pad, you will eventually build up some speed and begin running, which honestly is only slightly faster than walking, but put that aside for a moment. Once you get up to a run, any attempt to shift direction or stop will result in you continuing to move forward due to your momentum, which manifests itself in-game as a nearly uncontrollable slide that oftentimes will put you in a position that you do not want to be in. There are a number of situations where this can prove detrimental, such as if you're trying to avoid a deadly enemy, stop short of a falling rock, or prevent a fall off a precipitously high cliff. I can guarantee you that there will be moments where you'll slide forward to your doom unintentionally, and those moments can feel frustrating. There can also be some comedy as a result of your failings though, as if you do happen to slide out over the side of a cliff, you'll actually spend a few moments in suspended animation, floating in space like Wile E. Coyote in a classic Roadrunner cartoon, before plummeting to the earth. While I don't know that I loved the momentum-based movement in the game, I did appreciate the cartoon-like comedy that could occasionally come about because of failing to stop in time before walking, literally, off of a cliff. Otherwise, the game is, for the most part, an engaging, enjoyable experience filled with interesting situations that require some outside-the-box thinking in order to progress. With the game effectively being split into 2 parts, I have to say that I enjoyed the opening underground exploration section much more than I enjoyed Blobolonia, despite the brighter colors that Blobbert's homeworld provided. I feel like the first section of the game was much more puzzle-centric, which played to the game's strengths, while Blobolonia was based much more on controlling your movement to avoid and occasionally shoot enemies, an aspect of the title that was definitely not its strong suit. If Blobolonia was another world filled with new, unique puzzles, I would have been all for it. But as it stands, Blobolonia was more frustration than fun, at least until you figure out how best to make your way through the various screens that make up that world, after which it's more of a bump in the road as opposed to a meaningful, engaging set of puzzles. Blobolonia served to end the game on a bit of a sour note, which from my perspective is a shame, because the first 2/3 of the game were quite fun and interesting. So overall, I really enjoyed A Boy and His Blob, with the opening section where you have to figure out how to acquire a bunch of hidden treasure definitely being my favorite part of the entire experience. I loved plumbing the depths of the caverns below the earth, making an actual physical map of my surroundings, which brought me back to an era where the internet and instantly available information wasn't yet a thing, and discovering each and every treasure that there was to find. When I made it to Blobolonia, I was hoping for even more puzzles and exploration, perhaps with extra skills available since I knew that I had picked up a couple of special jellybeans that I hadn't used before, but unfortunately, Blobolonia was much less puzzle-focused and was more concerned with movement and combat, which I found to be a disappointment. I still think the good far outweighed the bad with the game overall, but I would be lying if I said it was a universally positive experience. So overall, what is our verdict on A Boy and His Blob? Well, A Boy and His Blob scratched an itch that I didn't realize I was having, that being the desire to play a well-thought-out puzzle platform game with a number of interesting challenges to progress through. And if the entire game was just that, this would have been an immediate inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. But the entire game is not that, and what I was left with was 2/3 of an awesome puzzle game and 1/3 of a middling combat platformer, which unfortunately drugged down the experience a bit. Because it's still an enjoyable game and one I recommend you all play, albeit not without fault, A Boy and His Blob is a solid addition to our list of golden oldies. It's not 100% excellent, but it is still a worthwhile, fun, and engaging experience, and I do highly encourage everyone check it out at some point in their gaming careers. I do believe it could have been much more, but even so, A Boy and His Blob in its current state does a lot right, and is therefore a very easy selection to join our ever-growing list of golden oldies. That was our episode on A Boy and His Blob, Trouble on Blobolonia. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is our next Sounds of the Classics episode, and this one is different because it is our listener grab bag episode. That means it is filled with all games and songs that you have sent to me, along with your thoughts as to why those songs are important to you. There's still just a little bit of time to get your selections in. If you could get me feedback by this upcoming Friday, June 7th, 2024, you may still have a chance to get your feedback and your selections featured in the show. We have gotten quite a few submissions, so we're definitely going to be doing multiple listener grab bag episodes in the future, but I am definitely hopeful that anybody who really wants to get in there, send it over, and I will do my best to make sure it's included in next week's episode. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about bolstering star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to make sure that I can deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to gather feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure that I am delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow our community, and I want to continue to focus on delivering the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode, which is our Sounds of the Classics, Listener Grab Bag Volume 1. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.